こんにちは、眠いロコです。Hey guys, how are you doing? Have you heard Japanese people say んです? んです is a really important expression for speaking natural Japanese. んです doesn't have a meaning on its own and can't be translated into English. It just adds nuance to your sentence.You can sometimes use んです or leave it out, but there are many situations where not using it makes your Japanese sound unnatural. So it's super important, but honestly, explaining it is kind of hard, so I didn't really want to cover it in a video. But I'll do my best to explain it clearly, so I'd be glad if you stayed with me until the end.Alright, let's get started. First, let's quickly go over how to make sentences with んです. You always add んです after the short form. For example, 行ったんです。おいしいんです。However, after not adjectives and nouns in the present affirmative form, you add not だ. For example, 綺麗なんです。日本人なんです。Alright, let's get to the main topic. When do you use んです? There are a few common explanations. Some people say you use んです when you are explaining a reason or a situation.Others say you use it when your emotions are involved and you want to say or ask something. All of those explanations are correct. But there's one important point that they don't mention. The key point is that you need some kind of underlying situation or context in order to use んです。So,What exactly is this underlying situation or context? Let's check out some examples. We'll start with questions that use んです. The first situation where you use んです question is when you have a reason for making that judgment. Let's imagine this situation. You are talking with a friend and start talking about anime.You like One Piece, so you want to ask if they like it too. In this situation, you'd just say, ワンピースは好きですか? But what if your friend has a Luffy keychain on their back? You'd think, oh, maybe they like One Piece. In that case, you'd ask, ワンピースが好きなんですか? So, with a regular question, the answer could be either yes or no. But when you ask with んです, you're basically expecting the answer to be yes. Let's look at another example. After a long vacation, you are talking with a friend and want to know if they traveled. In this situation, you'd simply ask, 旅行に行きましたか? But if your friend gives you a souvenir, then you'd ask, 旅行に行ったんですか? Because if they gave a souvenir, that means they must have gone somewhere. You have enough reason to make that judgment, so you use んです here. The second situation is when you feel some kind of emotion, such as surprise.For example, if you say, もう晩ご飯を食べましたか? You are simply asking whether they've eaten dinner or not. But if you say, もう晩ご飯を食べたんですか? It carries a nuance of surprise, like, this early? It's only 4. It looks like a question, but you are not really asking.You are expressing your surprise. There's one thing you need to be careful about here. If you are not careful with how you say ですか, it can sound like you are criticizing the person. I'm going to read the exact same sentence twice, but one of them is actually criticizing the listener. Listen carefully. まだ起きているんですか?まだ起きているんですか? The first rising intonation shows mild surprise or concern, but the second falling intonation sounds critical, almost like you should go to bed. So, if you don't want it to sound critical, use a rising intonation, even if it's not actually a question. The third situation is when you use です together with a question word. Question words are like 何、誰 or なんで. This also only works when there's some kind of underlying situation or context. So let's imagine another situation after a long break. You can't suddenly ask どこに行ったんですか? without any context. Only after the other person says something like 休みはいろいろなところに行きました. You can say どこに行ったんですか? Let's think about another situation. Your friend looks really down. You can tell something must have happened. So you ask, どうしたんですか? 何かあったんですか? Or you can use it like this. この服素敵ですね。どこで買ったんですか? In this case, there is a context. That outfit looks nice. You're interested in the outfit and you want to ask about it. If you say, どこで買いましたか? It sounds like you're just confirming a fact. It kind of feels weird, awkward. When you ask a question with なんで, there's always some kind of situation behind it, and you are asking about that reason. And because there's always a situation or context, basically you always use ですか with なんで. When you learned なんで or どうして, you might have seen example sentences like なんで日本語を勉強していますか? or どうして来ませんでしたか? But they're actually unnatural. Japanese people never say that. So the natural expressions are なんで日本語を勉強しているんですか? and どうして来なかったんですか? When you use a question word together with ですか, a falling intonation also makes it sound critical. For example, なんで昨日来なかったんですか? or 誰がそんなこと言ったんですか? So please be careful. Now let's move on to affirmative sentences. The first situation is when you use です to explain a reason. Let's look at an example. 今日のレッスンを休んでもいいですか? 頭が痛いんです。When explaining a reason, many learners probably think of から or ので. You can use から or ので instead of です. But you cannot combine です with から or ので. For example, you can say, 今日のレッスンを休んでもいいですか？頭が痛いので。But you cannot say 頭が痛いんですので。However, when you are criticizing someone, you can use です together with から。For example, もう大人なんですから子供みたいなことを言わないでください。Especially, it's better to use です when you are being scolded. For example, なんで遅刻したんですか？すみません、電車が遅延したんです。This です expresses the feeling of I know I did something wrong, but I have a reason. So it's often called the excuse です。You also often use です when you are turning something down. For example, 今週の土曜日遊びませんか？すみません、その日はちょっと予定があるんです。The second situation is when you want to emphasize your own opinion. Let's look at an example. 毎日残業ばかりでもう仕事を辞めたいんです。Even if you say もう仕事を辞めたいです、the meaning doesn't change, but using です makes your feeling sound stronger and more emphasized. When you say もう仕事を辞めたいんです、the listener feels like, oh, they truly want to quit, or they must be exhausted. You also use です when you are sharing information the listener doesn't know, like when you start with 実は。For example, 実は私は韓国で生まれたんです。私は彼のことが好きなんです。And the last use of です is when you use it as a lead-in before you say what you want to say. Up until now, you had a premise first and then added です. But this use is the opposite. You start with です to explain the background or lead into what you really want to say. It's often used when asking a question and together with が or けど。For example, 映画のチケットがあるんですが、一緒に見に行きませんか？すみません、聞きたいことがあるんですけど、今大丈夫ですか？ If you say 映画のチケットがあります。一緒に見に行きませんか？ or すみません、聞きたいことがあります。今大丈夫ですか？ It sounds unnatural, very textbook-like. This is a very common expression, so make sure to remember it. How was today's lesson? There was a lot to learn, so I'm sure it felt a bit tough. But です is a really important expression, so keep practicing it. It will make your Japanese sound much more natural. The best way to practice these expressions is to expose yourself to real native Japanese. These days, there are so many easy tools like language exchange apps, where you can talk with native speakers, so try using them. The next video is about んだ. It's the short form version of んです, but you can use it in even more situations. So don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. and stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one. またねー。